Hello, good afternoon or morning, afternoon, barely. I'm Jane Harmon, President and CEO of the Wilson Center, and it is my absolute delight to introduce a dear friend of mine, Salam Fayyad, and I get to do this. I'm sad that Ambassador Joe Gildenhorn and his amazing wife Alma are not here, but we could not do events like this without their support. And so we don't do events like this without their support. We also, and I don't know if either of these people is here, is Bobby Stein here? No? Or Carolyn Kaplan? They too, yeah, hi. They too have been very helpful to this series, which is the Gildenhorn Middle East Forum, which is part of our Middle East program, which as a newly minted, he's not newly minted, but he's newly minted as director. He's oldly minted, Aaron David Miller, who will moderate this conversation. So I got to talk about Salam for just a minute. I don't know when I first met him, but he had me at hello. I love the guy. And if for those of you who don't know him, I don't know how you could not know him, you will love him too. He's an economist by training with deep academic background. He was both finance minister and prime minister of the Palestinian Authority, and he was a member of the Palestinian Legislative Council. He just was the most competent person, in my view, period, in the Palestinian Authority, for which he paid a very large price. But he is still courageous, outspoken. The last time I saw him actually was here a few weeks ago, but the time before that, when I saw him, was in Palestine when I brought my grandchildren to his office. He was then heading an NGO there in Ramallah, and he had presents for everyone. I mean, how does it get better than this, to have a guy who's like that, and who once, when I called him, I guess from Jerusalem, I was there as part of a congressional delegation. I said, Salam, we'd all love to meet with you. He said, no, can't do it. It's the evening and I have to be with my kids. So he is perfectly competent. He is incredibly courageous, and he's got his values on straight. So I don't know what else I can say about him personally that would be higher praise. I think he's wonderful. And I think it's wonderful that he's here. He will, I hope, talk about some of the tough issues we're all thinking about. You know, what's next in this quest for some form of agreement between the Palestinian Authority and the Israelis. What's next in the region? Is there reason for hope? And Aaron obviously will moderate a debate. I just want to acknowledge one other person in the audience who's doing her email in the front row, and that would be Trudy Rubin, who is the only foreign correspondent for a major newspaper who happens to be a woman. She also is a dear friend of mine. That's not true anymore. It's fake news. Columnist, not correspondent. Oh, excuse me. Columnist for a major newspaper. Picky. She and I were college friends back in the day, and I just admire her tenacity. She's headed to the region shortly, and more later. Just read what she writes. But it is with great pride that we welcome you here, Salam, and that I now turn this event over to Aaron Miller, who, in addition to directing our Middle East program, is also our Vice President for New Initiatives, who, as most of you know, served 6 Secretaries of State back in the day. The Middle East was his portfolio, and he is certainly up to speed. And for those of you who saw yesterday the conversation here with Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, we at the Wilson Center think we're clocking it. We're really getting the best possible people here to talk about the news of the day. So again, please welcome Aaron. The floor is yours.
Jane, thanks so much. And I want to reiterate first something that Jane said about Salam. I spent a lot of time in the peacemaking biz. I'm no longer in that biz. But along the way, over the course of 20 plus years, I met a lot of fascinating characters. Israelis, Palestinians, Arabs, Europeans, a variety of others interested in the pursuit of Israeli-Palestinian peace. Some who made contributions, some who did not. But rarely have I encountered anyone with the clarity, the honesty, and the integrity of Salam Fayyad. And Salam brings something else, which is the rare combination of the practitioner and the theorist. And once you're in the arena, options usually shrink, opposition grows, and you begin to learn sooner rather than later of the price you pay for honest analysis, which more often than not leads to paralysis, which is in large part an appropriate departure point for today. We're going to get to all of the current issues, relations between Fatah and Hamas, the pursuit of Israeli-Palestinian peace, the putative Trump initiative, and according to media reports will be announced sometime early next year or so. But I wanted to take advantage, at least during the next 20 minutes, since we have you here, to dive deeply into a matter that you have spoken about and thought a lot about. You left the arena in 2013 as Prime Minister of the Palestinian Authority. It's 4 years in which you've had time to look deeply into the problem of Arab-Israeli peacemaking and the issue of Palestinian politics and internal decision-making. And I know you believe, perhaps not as strongly as I do, that Michael Jackson was probably right in Man in the Mirror when he said, if you want to make a change in your life, then you can blame other people, fine. But the reality is you look in the mirror and you start with yourself. And because that's where the change comes from. That's where ownership comes from. And Israelis and Palestinians, frankly, in my view, it's no secret, need a very long look in the mirror. So Salam, let me start with this question. You spoke publicly at Princeton about Palestinian self-empowerment. Let me just quote something that you said. Quote, it's more up to us, Palestine, than Israel or the international community. Empowerment is needed to end the occupation. When you talk about Palestinian self-empowerment under occupation, under Israeli occupation, what do you mean exactly?
Thank you. I'll get to that, but not before I thank my dear friend Jan Harman for the kind and warm introduction. Like her, I don't recall when we first met. Must have happened a long time ago. I have very fond recollection of all the encounters that we had and recollection of the non-encounter that she mentioned. Great to be here at the Wilson Center. I'm really delighted and honored to be with you. I thank you also for your kind introduction as well. Lots to talk about when it comes to favorite topic of mine, actually, question of self-empowerment for the Palestinians, quest for empowerment by us. I'd say even under occupation, but I recently started to say especially under occupation for a reason. But before I get into this, and maybe as a prelude, it may be worthwhile. I learned from my days in politics long time ago to ask myself a question when I wake up every day. What is today? What sort of observances? Where are we? I'm going to some place to inaugurate a project or something like this. And there's always something that has happened. This is a long-standing conflict with stories, with observances and all. And today, ladies and gentlemen, happens to be the internationally United Nations sponsored International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people. It's an observance that has been taking place since 1977 by resolution of the United Nations. And a lot has happened over the past 40 years since that resolution was passed. Not many or enough good things, obviously, given where we are, and in terms of that solidarity translating to the kind of thing that we all would want to see happen, the emergence of a fully sovereign state of Palestine on the territory occupied by Israel in 1967 as a key element of bringing this conflict to an end. It also happens to be exactly to the day 5 years since a landmark resolution was passed by the United Nations General Assembly 5 years ago that elevated Palestine status to non-member observer status at the time. And like my commentary on the resolution by the United Nations on declaring this as International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian people, 29th of November, I'm sad to say that actually here we are 5 years after that landmark resolution. The reality of the Israeli occupation is a lot more deeply entrenched today than it was then. we definitely need to really get on with it and try to find ways in which to make this work better for the benefit of all, if this is really going to be brought to an end. And I hope that in the course of this conversation, we will be making some contribution, however modestly, toward that end. I think we definitely need to have conversations of this kind, do some introspection. There's not much wrong with it, actually, if in fact it's used not to engage in infinite recrimination and all, but to really actually ask ourselves honestly, where do we go from here? What are the requirements? And to answer your question about empowerment, how important I see it on the Palestinian side as the key instrument of getting us there in terms of ending the occupation that began in 1967. So much so that I actually see the Israeli occupation, ending the occupation as, on the one hand, and Palestinian self-empowerment on the other as two sides of the same coin. And given that ending the occupation that began in 1967 is a theme and an objective that Palestinians all over share, I believe it's important to ask ourselves the question of how do we really get there? And because I see self-empowerment as the other side of that coin, I really focus on it. When we say a two-state solution, we have to remember that one of those two states has actually been around for 7 decades now. So the question is really about the emergence of that other state, an independent, sovereign state of Palestine on the territory occupied by Israel in 1967. If you really look at it this way, then you really begin to ask yourself the question of what is it that's needed in order for that to happen. And the focus then will be on that which we Palestinians must really doggedly pursue, an act of projecting the reality of Palestinian statehood on the ground, despite the occupation, in order to end it. And some would take issue with this, saying, how can you possibly say that? How can you possibly dream of empowering yourselves under an occupation that's pretty much designed to disempower you? And it's not empowerment in an absolute sense that I talk about. I actually talk about empowerment in the sense of critical mass of it, just enough of it to really get us over the hump. To say we cannot do anything because of how oppressive the occupation is, and it is for sure, and because of it we cannot do anything, is a cop-out. There is a great deal that needs to be done. If this is about really bringing a two-state solution to fruition, it is about the emergence of a fully sovereign state of Palestine. So we Palestinians, at long last, can enjoy that which is an absolute right for all peoples around the world, to live as free people with dignity in a country of our own. That is the essence, actually, of part of what Vice President Pence said yesterday when he quoted Ben-Gurion in the declaration of the establishment of the State of Israel, when he said it was natural right for the Jewish people to be the masters of their destiny or fate, like all other nations in a fully in a sovereign state of their own. We are like all other nations. We Palestinians are very much deserving of the opportunity to enjoy that right, and it really must be about that. But to do it, it is about the emergence of an independent, sovereign Palestinian state. The key task is to project the reality of that state on the ground to the fullest extent possible, notwithstanding the impediments and all. And that's really the essence of what it is I'm talking about. Because if you really look at it, the gap between us and Israel was always wide, but has been growing progressively wider. The gap between us, you're a veteran of this, and by the way, you learn something new every day. The first time I hear someone refer to peacemaking business as biz. So, and nobody kind of commented on it, but anyway, you're a veteran of this, and you knew the difficulties and how wide the gap was, but the gap has grown progressively wider. And so what do? Clearly, a process of transformation must take place in order to bring about better conditions for convergence. And there is nothing better than really us engaging in that dogged pursuit of empowerment by projecting the reality of Palestinian statehood on the ground that is more capable. There's nothing that's more capable of bringing about that transformation. It's inspiring. It definitely inspires us. It is our own responsibility. After all, we're talking about a Palestinian state. If we Palestinians do not engage in building it, who is going to build it for us? Yes, we need to be enabled, for sure, but then we state those requirements for success in relation to an objective that we say is important to us, and we engage in doing it. That's the kind of virtuous cycle that I'm really talking about. So if we really begin the conversation by saying, what does it take in order for that sovereign state of Palestine to emerge? And part of the answer, to begin the answer, you say, you need to begin to build it. I say, that's logical. What is it that's really needed there? Then you begin to identify requirements of success to really get you there. A lot of it has to really come from within. There are certain factors that are needed externally to enable this effort to really be successful. But then you frame the entire discussion in this way. You really cease to think in terms of somehow parachuting all of the difficulties and somehow coming up with a solution, and then worry about the business of projecting the reality of Palestinian state on the ground. And I remind everyone that even though it is generally perceived, and I myself even said it, that Israel was established in 1948, Israel was not established in 1948. Statehood, Israeli statehood was proclaimed officially in 1948, but institutions of the state of Israel predated that occurrence for many, many years. That's pretty much what I'm talking to you about. That does require a serious and most determined effort to really actually project that reality of Palestinian state on the ground. It does require an articulation of a national vision around which all of our people can coalesce, and a vision that can form a basis for approaching the international community and saying, this is what is really required in order for that process to make sense, in order for it to succeed, and begin to answer the question of how can you possibly even begin to think about doing all of those things under occupation, because then it really will begin to make sense in a dynamic way. It will generate a positive dynamic. It's capable of doing that sort of thing.
You had a chance, this is not theory for you, you had a chance to pursue this as both finance minister and Palestinian prime minister. And you yourself identify 4 obstacles that made it very difficult to achieve this kind of self-empowerment. And your point on the Israelis is well taken. The Israelis would make the argument that even before Hitler started killing Jews, most of the institutions that would come to characterize the modern state of Israel, political, military, and economic institutions, were already in place. But the Israelis operated in a different period in comparison to the challenges that Palestinians face. I don't think there's a precedent in modern history for a nation negotiating its way out of occupation and at the same time building credible, transparent, and accountable institutions of governance. But back to this point, you identified 4 obstacles that stood in your way.
Yeah.
One was the problem of challenging political elites within the Palestinian political establishment. A second, in 2007, was the division within the Palestinian national movement. A third, and you put Israel as number 3, was the fact that not only did the Israelis enable or support what you were doing, various Israeli activities and policies actively worked against what you were doing. And finally, you put some of the responsibility on the donor community for not being as supportive. So I guess my question is, it's not that I don't believe in what you're saying, I do. I believe this is all about ownership. I think the genius who said that in the history of the world nobody ever washed a rental car is right, because people care only about what they own. And if Israelis and Palestinians don't own this, neither Jared Kushner nor Jason Greenblatt is going to be able to fix it. So I guess what's changed? Those 4 factors still stand in large degree as impediments. What do you think?
Yeah, and to be honest with you, I try to, in articulating that concept and in assessing the extent to which it was successful, as a matter of fact, try to be as objective as possible, although this was deeply personal in many ways. And I thought about it really a long time, out of sense of responsibility. You know, it was me who was there, kind of leading this effort, but to try to distance yourself from it and look at it from a distance and ask yourself a question: what went wrong, what went right, and all of that. I really honestly try to be as objective as I possibly can, and I could think of those factors that you mentioned as reasons why that approach did not yield the desired outcome. But it was not really all failure. Before I really address your question, at some level, in the technical sense, it was a huge success. When we launched that plan and the government adopted it in August of 2009, the plan actually said that within a 2-year period, we Palestinians are going to be ready for statehood. Of course, there is a lot in what I have just said and what was said then. It was supposed to signal many things, amongst which, in the most constructive of ways, to tell the whole world, we Palestinians are tired of this occupation. But rather than say, so therefore we are turning the table, we said we're going to be ready for statehood in 4 years. That was supposed to respond to something that was out there, that was said back in 2002 that not many people remember, and not many people understood exactly what it was about. I'm referring specifically here to famous policy statement made by then President of the United States, George W. Bush, June 2002, when he said, and he was the first sitting U.S. president to really say actually that the solution is about 2 states, and the state of Palestine alongside the state of Israel living side by side in peace and security. That's not all he said. He went on to say that somehow the Palestinians had to earn the privilege. Now, there are different ways you can look at this. One is how unfair, because after all, we're talking about the right to self-determination for the Palestinian people. And that, to me, and to all, should be an absolute right, not subject to any condition or conditions or conditionality. So one way of responding to this was to say what I have just said, how grossly unfair. Another was to be pragmatic about this and say, okay, what is it that we're talking about? We're talking about improving governance, but who benefits from improving governance? First and foremost, George W. Bush, the United States, Israel. It's the Palestinian people. It's the Palestinian people. So let's do all of those things for the benefit of our own people anyway. And if it's a pretext, let's dispel this notion and defeat it. So that was really the background. So in 2 years, we Palestinians think we're going to be ready for statehood. And that meant actually successfully projecting the reality of Palestinian statehood on the ground in the form of strong, competent, well-functioning institutions of a state, with a lot of infrastructural projects also on the ground to bring about improvement in people's livelihood and the rest of it, building schools, ensure that we have adequate water supply, electricity, and what have you. And we really had this vision articulated, and we really had specific sectoral visions and plans as to how we're going to really get there. On the strength of doing just that, we somehow, I feel, were able to enter into a quasi-contractual relationship with the international community. It was not formal. We didn't sit around the table and say, we do this, you do that. We took the initiative. We just put this thing out without prior consultation with any external parties at all. And the world was drawn into this. They liked the idea. And there developed this kind of really sense of a quasi-contractual relationship. Palestinians do their thing, project the reality of their state on the ground. We will help them out doing that, but also help with the political process to bring about sovereignty, impart sovereignty to that which they will ultimately produce. And then we went about the business of doing that. I said 2 years. This was supposed to, end. The timeline actually started in August of 2009, so it was supposed to end in August 2011. In April of 2011, a year and a half into this, we were declared state-worthy, actually, by the international community, convening in Brussels at the time, United States, European Union, everybody. Israel was there, the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, and all attendees, participants in the meeting, endorsed key finding of 3 important reports that were issued or prepared for that purpose, one by the United Nations, another by my former employer, the IMF, and a third by the World Bank. And the essence of what they said was, we certify that Palestinian institutions are actually of a quality and state of maturity that compares favorably to institutions of states that have been around a long period of time. That was really quite a remarkable statement. To me, that was a birth certificate for the concept, for the reality of Palestinian statehood. That was the kind of birth certificate that we're looking for, and we got it. We got that. So at that level, I think it was successful. Where it failed is in the other part. You know, this is not really about building for the sake of building, although building is important in and of itself. There's no question about that. This is about actually doing the necessary building, projecting reality of Palestinian state on the ground, to use it as an instrument for liberation, with us Palestinians taking full agency in that act of liberation. Think of how powerful, how transformative this was. And it really was very inspiring at that level. So I would not want to really do injustice to the story by focusing only on the failures, although the failure was actually dramatic, there's no question. Because the other end of this clearly did not happen. There was no progress made toward attaining sovereignty and all of that, and it was discredited. And then you get into the analysis of why, and you mentioned those 4 factors. It is true, as a matter of fact, that you know, this vision was not adopted at all levels, for sure. There were a lot of skeptics, with good reason. You know, people questioning the notion of building and projecting reality of Palestinian statehood on the ground under occupation, saying, how can you possibly do this? Look, we can't even move around with all the restrictions on mobility, with all the restrictions in force, and some 60% of the West Bank, where we Palestinians cannot do anything without securing a permit from Israeli authorities. Try that if you like, as a matter of fact. Its system is highly capricious, to say the very least. And with the siege on Gaza, with the separation, the rest of it. So they were skeptical, I think, with good reason. Some were even cynical, as a matter of fact, saying, well, even if you succeed, all you will succeed in doing would be to make it easier for the occupation. So in a sense, therefore, even if you succeed, you're contributing to perpetuating the occupation. So here you are, you're saying, as being there and having to deal with issues of national mindset. It's really an enormous challenge when you really address this. And you have to really accept, the skepticism. Cynicism, I'm not really sure about, to be honest with you. But if you really think about it, it's devastating. Here you are. We Palestinians are afraid of trying because we're reluctant to try because we're afraid of failure, or worse, we are afraid of success, if you can imagine. So if we will succeed, all we manage to do is make it easier for the Israeli occupation to continue. So there is that, there was that. It was the government that really adopted it. It was not adopted by all components of the political system as an anchor, so to speak. Nor was it seen as a fully integrated political vision. On good days, it was seen as an add-on. To me, it was the thing, not the add-on. It was not the topping. It was the cake itself. You understand what I'm saying? Which is a basic difference, fundamental difference in approach. If you really think this is the real thing, then it's the anchor. You build everything around it. If you think it's an add-on, well, you can't do without if it's not there or something like this. And that, because it was not really seen for what we intended it to be, a fully integrated political vision, the timing of things that we did was not really synchronized in a good way to really help give a boost to this in a political sense. And at the time when I recall, as a matter of fact, international community, key players were beginning to ask, it looks like Palestinians are going to really succeed in what they said they were going to do. 1 year into this. Really, they'll come to me and say, well, it looks like we're going to get there. Everybody, well, look at this. Institutions are getting stronger and better and fairer and more accountable, and things are improving, security conditions are improving, everything is improving. So what are we going to do for you? This is the essence of what we're going to do for us is to really continue to help us do this. but importantly, to revamp the political process between us and Israel in a way that can really actually deliver meaningful sovereignty for Palestinian people. But they were beginning to ask this question. But around that time, things happened in a way that actually that kind of question sort of really gave way. Instead of really asking, what do we do for the Palestinians or with them, better, what do we do about them? Oh, they're going to the United Nations. Oh my God, what are we going to do about the Palestinians going to the United Nations? So the conversation changed completely. You understand what I'm saying? So that's one set of consideration. Another, of course, which is very important on the Palestinian side, is statehood separation of the political polity, which to this day still exists. I'm talking about the situation in Gaza, following the violent takeover of power by Hamas in Gaza in 2007. And to me, and I even said this, I remember, because the mood in Brussels that April of 2011 was very jovial, and everybody was asking me. I said, yeah, I feel very good and happy, but it's not really complete, obviously, because there can be no meaningful, full readiness for statehood without Gaza, and there was statehood separation. That's still there. So the effort is lacking in credibility too because of that, in a main way. Third factor you mentioned is basically Israel. Israel professed a great deal of enthusiasm about this. You heard many Israeli officials time and again saying how good an idea this was and all. But if you really actually were to look for things that they actually did to validate this in a political way, the answer is nothing. Let me give you an example. This is not an exaggeration or anything like this. One thing in particular that I regarded as highly meaningful at the time in terms of imparting political validation to this technocratic vision would have been for Israel to stop sending its army to so-called Area A, meaning urban areas in the West Bank. There's no question, and the Israelis would be the first to actually acknowledge this. There was vast improvement in security conditions. Vast improvement in security conditions. There was no need for them to really be sending their troops to Area A, meaning cities of West Bank, including the seat of our government, in Ramallah. Time and again, repeatedly, time and again. And guess what that does to you? We asked, we made this ask. Why? Because we wanted to really actually demonstrate, particularly to the skeptics, that the act of projecting reality of Palestinian statehood on the ground is meaningful in a political sense, in the sense of it taking us somewhere on the question of sovereignty and all of that sort of thing. And imagine if Israel, for example, had decided at the time to stop sending its troops, would that really actually being cited as a deliverable of this Palestinian effort? States are defined by where their security services are, not by where the security services of the occupying power are. You understand what I'm saying? So here we were kind of building, fortifying, improving functionality of our institutions and the rest of it. On the other hand, nighttime there is a raid with Israelis getting in, sometimes really for no reason, no obvious reason, more like showboating even. How can you possibly reconcile? This did a lot of damage to the credibility of the program in a political sense. It made it really look like an exercise in adapting to the reality of occupation, which it was not, but unfortunately it was very damaging. I just give this as one example of this that really were to not provide the enabling environment that would have been needed. You mentioned the international community, yes. This may actually come as a surprise to many because the general perception is that the international community was very generous to the Palestinian people, Palestinian Authority, and that generally is true. Historically, we received large sums of money from all donors, including the United States. However, if you really, as a matter of fact, look at the critical period, 2011, 2010, 11, and 12, you will see every year there was drop-off of 30% relative to a mutually agreed baseline with our donors. Every year, 30% less, 30% less, 30% less. Worse, that shortfall was concentrated in the budget support component of the financing requirement, which really vastly undermined our capacity to meet our operational expenses, including paying salaries. So here we are at a time when we were supposed to be ready for state, not able to even pay salaries. And that, of course, was a field day for the skeptics. So they're saying they're ready for state that don't even have salary to pay They don't have money to pay salaries. So the whole thing, in a way, unraveled in this most unfortunate of ways. But this is not really to say that this is really over with or anything like that. I'm still a firm believer in this way about getting to where we must end up going and where we must really get end of the day. Today, I'm as committed and as determined, and I feel as strongly about it today as I did then, as we way forward. Besides, once again, what are the alternatives exactly? We hear all kinds of reports about activities aimed at reviving the peace process and all. There were many rounds. I mean, it's not like there was no peace process activities before. There was a lot of activity. It was not for sure shortage of activity. But the question, how do you really actually do it? What is it that you're going to be doing to bring about the transformation necessary in order for that to happen end of the day? So I would add even another reason for why I think this approach is needed today is because of the impossibility of really getting to where everybody says they want to get overnight. We can't. We cannot really get there separated. We must really unify our polity because, you know, at the height of international diplomacy, the question was asked, but what about Gaza? Even if these negotiations are successful,
Right.
What about Gaza? What kind of answer are you going to be able to give? So clearly we must really do this, and we must anchor it on this empowerment and beginning with the question of uniting our own polity,
All right.
unifying.
George, let's turn to that for a sec, because clearly successful national movements demonstrate a certain cohesion and unity in strategy.
Yes.
The ones who succeed, either through co-optation or repression, end up creating a situation where they exercise a monopoly over the forces of violence within their national movement and a monopoly over their political tactics. So the ultimate manifestation of the dysfunction you're describing was 2007, where the Palestinian national movement literally became like Noah's Ark. There were two of everything. Two constitutions, two statelets, two sets of security services, two sets of patrons, two visions of what Palestine was supposed to be and where it was supposed to be. So now you have a break in this 10-year separation to some degree. Is unity, and I'm not talking faux unity, I'm talking unity, one gun, one authority, one negotiating position. Is that feasible?
Well, some of the elements you mentioned actually are attributes of a state in some way, key attributes of state. I mean, it's unity of everything, monopoly over use of force, legitimate use of force. We Palestinians have to struggle with this notion. You alluded to it in your own remarks, as a matter of fact. The national movement, or movements, if you will, a national struggle, because of circumstance and history, context, we found ourselves having to live by the logic of statehood without being a state, including the most important area of security. There's no question that, you know, when you're a state, that's what defines you. Complete monopoly over legitimate use of force. I mean, that really has to be there. We're not there, obviously, today. Nor are we there relative to the norms set by the Oslo framework, as a matter of fact. The commitments made back in 1993 by the PLO on behalf of all Palestinians, not universally acceptable within Palestinian polity, by factions that have substantial political presence and weight. It's a major challenge, you know, to really actually deal with the situation. Clearly, one that is a source of serious disempowerment for the Palestinian people in our quest for freedom and dignity. So we must really find ways to deal with this. The quest here must be for an effective management of pluralism, if you will, to the fullest extent we can, taking into account, on the one hand, the requirements for good national governance, and also requirements for international engagement. I mean, there are expectations of us internationally, gold standard set by the Oslo framework, if you will, not lived up to or accepted even by all Palestinian factions. And there's also the requirement of good national governance that has also certain requirements. Can we really come up with a concept, a way in which we can begin this serious effort aimed at ultimately achieving full unity? My answer is yes, it is possible. It's not going to really be a purist approach to solving problems. It's a practitioner's approach to solving problems. It's a pragmatic approach, one that really basically does the most that can be done under the circumstances, and hope that somehow putting this in a credible way can get us some traction. It also happens to provide an illustration of how, if we begin the conversation by asking ourselves the question of what needs to happen in order for us to have a Palestinian state, when we talk about the peace process, how, if we really begin the conversation by asking this question, we begin to really frame things in a way that pave the way to engagement eventually, in a meaningful way. And as I say, it's not a purist in ways, but it I think would represent a substantial improvement over what we have right now. If one gun, one unitary of control over weapons and all is impossible, we are not a state and all of that, you ask yourself the question, well, of course you prefer to have that if you can, but if you can't, what do? You ask yourself the question, can we agree on policy? This is an important question. Can we agree on policy? What are we talking about here? Which factions are we talking about? We're talking about factions like Hamas. We're talking about factions like Jihad Islami, obviously. They have not accepted Oslo back in 1993, as everybody knows. And not the only Palestinian factions not to accept, but they're the main ones that not accepting Oslo. And that framework got discredited over time. There are many within the PLO itself that really are not that enthralled by it anymore, as this is a vast understatement. So given that they really do not accept the gold standard that's enshrined in Oslo, open-ended commitment to nonviolence, you ask the question, can we really get commitment by everybody to a time-bound commitment to nonviolence? I can tell you that's possible. And I can tell you something like this did happen before at times in and around Gaza. Now, is it the gold standard that's enshrined in Oslo? The answer is no. But is it a qualitatively better situation than where we are now? I'd say yes. So this is how you really begin to do these things, and I can really expand on this in the course of conversation, discussion, if you will, maybe. But essentially, it is really about trying to find a way in which all factions and all players feel included in a genuine sense of partnership. That's what I meant when I said requirements of good national governance, require partnership, and requirements of international engagement, meaning the extent to which the world would be accepting of whatever it is we Palestinians sort of really cook amongst ourselves. And here what I really believe can happen is for us to convene a framework that's been around for a long time. It's been dormant. It's called Unified Leadership Framework, if you will. It's been called different names, but it's dormant. But it actually consists of the Secretary Generals of all Palestinian factions, not only PLO factions, but others. And my proposal is actually for this to be convened as soon as possible, and for everybody around the table to accept the PLO as sole legitimate representative of Palestinian people, everyone, including Hamas and Jihad, which is important, as sole legitimate representative of Palestinian people, without the PLO having to change the platform on the basis of which it entered into the Oslo framework and the Oslo Accords with Israel on. Now, what is the catch in this? Why would Hamas accept PLO as sole legitimate representative of Palestinian people without the PLO changing its platform. And I'm proposing actually some kind of compromise. It has to do with the nature of that representation role. So far, it has meant the power to decide, effectively. We said, ever since the PLO started to be referred to as the sole legitimate representative of Palestinian people, that had effectively meant the power and the authority to decide on behalf of all Palestinians. That's exactly what our late President Yasser Arafat back in 1988, when he stood up in that very famous speech in Algiers and said, on behalf of the Arab, in the name of God, in the name of the Arab Palestinian people, I hereby declare a state of Palestine. You remember that? On behalf of Palestinian people, all of them. And at the time, he really was representing the masses, everyone. And how well that was received and everything. That was actually the occasion. That was when the PLO, in a formal way, signaled its acceptance of two-state solution in a formal way. And then Madrid, and then Oslo, and then the rest of it. So but forever, PLO, being sole legitimate representative of Palestinian people, had meant power to decide. I propose, as a compromise, for it to retain that role, but in the sense of it being the conveyor of Palestinian position to the world. I mean, the political body that conveys the Palestinian position forged on a bigger table to the world. Palestinian position on issues of matters of national interest, negotiations, what do we do, where do we go from here? It's done in this platform that includes the PLO and factions that are not in it. And they're sitting there, they're part of the conversation, they decide like everyone else. Once everything is decided, then the PLO can take that position to the world and say, on behalf of Palestinians, this is what we want to do. This is what we need to negotiate. So it does retain its standing as a representative of Palestinian people, but its role, really, as a matter of fact, is defined in the way that I had just described to you. This way, everybody feels a sense of partnership. And no one, not including Israel, can say, oh, the Palestinians reneged on anything, because the PLO has not changed its platform. We do not want it to change its platform. It is the same. It is the same. And factions that do not agree with it are not in it either. But they are in another platform where everybody discusses, everybody converses, everybody suggests, then there is a decision to be made. Once that decision is made, is conveyed to the world by the PLO. The world deals with the PLO. So everyone has a sense of partnership here, real partnership. On the national governance side, everybody can feel sense of partnership if they are part of the government. So managing the affairs of Palestinian people in West Bank and Gaza is entrusted to the PA under Oslo, which, among other organs, is run by a government. I say it's about time for that government to be inclusive of all players in the Palestinian political spectrum. You do those things, and among other things, key important things that this unified leadership framework is to decide, this is how you can use this as an anchor, is to say, okay, what is it that we can agree on here to go tell the world? That's where I bring in this notion of time-bound commitment to nonviolence. If, in fact, in a meeting like this, all factions assembled around the table say, yes, we accept a truce for a year, 2 years, 3 years, whatever they agree, at which point then President Abbas can go to the world with power that not paralleled by even the power that the legendary Yasser Arafat had after Oslo was signed, and utter the magic words on behalf of the Arab Palestinian people. You understand what I'm saying? Then he really would be representing everyone from a position of strength and say, we have this to offer. We have this time-bound commitment to nonviolence. The term of this would be, it's an interval at the end of which the occupation, by the end of this interval, the occupation has to end. There has to be agreement on a timeline to end the occupation. If we can really do this in an integrated way, and I don't see this as an act of belligerence. I can see us doing this in partnership with everybody. I can even see us going hand in hand with all key players to the United Nations, getting this enshrined in a Security Council resolution that provides for a timeline for ending the occupation. There is this commitment to nonviolence everywhere, by the way. I'm not talking about only Gaza, everywhere. There's policy that's agreed to, Everybody is supposed to respect. Everybody is sitting around the government. Top tier leadership is participating in this government, not by proxy. So they're responsible for everything that happens. During this period of time, we are to rebuild our institutions, really, unify them after more than 10 years of separation, unify our laws and regulations. This takes time. This takes time. We have 2 ministries of everything. We have 2, 3 different sets of laws and regulations, Gaza, West Bank, and what have you. This does take time. And wouldn't it be very good for everybody if we are able to do this where there is no violence? It's in our own best interest, as a matter of fact.
It would be extraordinary.
So this is a way where, yes, you do not have the perfect, but you have the good. And the good in this case, in my humble opinion, should be good enough. But can we really be counted on to take the initiative and say, this is it, this is what we really can do? That's really what I'm calling for. This is the kind of really self-empowerment that I'm really calling for. This is what really taking the initiative means to me. This is a sense of, this is exactly what I mean when I say it's really a lot more up to us than anyone else. Because that really would change the conversation, in my humble opinion.
Hold that thought, Salam. Fascinating. Let's go to questions. We have about 10 minutes plus. Yes, and please identify yourselves briefly and then ask a question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. My name is Khalid Khairi, مدير مكتب قناة الغد في Washington. For Prime Minister, do you think it is time for a new leadership in Palestine as a part of reforms domestically? Also, many states are talking about historic deal. Would you agree that a deal is possible to solve this conflict?
Let's take one of those, Salam.
Yeah.
Up to you.
Oh, yeah.
New leadership, or is a deal possible?
A deal is possible, but I do not see one around the corner. I believe it is well within what can be done, but for the reasons amongst, I mentioned several, I don't see one around the corner right now, given the huge gap that exists on issues that were negotiated many times before. And I think it's really some quarter of a century since Madrid. It's about time that people stop kind of really saying, the parameters of a solution are well known. If only we can get the parties around the table. This has been tried many times before, and it's not going to work. But I honestly believe if we really begin anew, push the reset button, so to speak, in a serious way, doing the kinds of things that I'm really talking to you about, then a sense of possibility about this begins to be reintroduced in the discourse again. And that's what you really need right now. Question of leadership and new leadership, I know this is a matter of interest, and it's often raised wherever you go. You're asked, like, what is going to really happen? Who is going to really succeed President Abbas, and all of that? And I, to tell you, quite frankly, I honestly believe this is really the wrong question to ask. It shouldn't be who, it should be what. What kind of process? What kind of process should we have? I mean, leaders come and leaders go. This is natural, different ways. By the way, part of what I'm talking about in the scheme that I kind of briefly outlined involves elections, but not tomorrow. It's not really realistic to think in the terms that people talk about elections in 6 months. I just don't see that as a realistic proposition. But if, let's just say for the sake of argument, that the time period that we're talking about is, let's just say 3 years. We estimate it's going to take us 3 years to rebuild our institutions, reunify the laws and everything. I'd say some 6 months before the end of that period, we should have elections. And I think that's long enough time for the political space to be opened up, for there to be participation by the youth, by everyone. So who's going to really be doing what then? God knows, to be honest with you. But I think the right question is what, not who. And that would be aided enormously, actually, if in fact ideas of the kind, not exclusively, but of the kind that I'm putting on the table, are actually followed. This is a unified leadership framework that is to be convened by none other than President Abbas himself. And by the way, regardless of what is said about his term in office having expired and all, and that he is into third term of a one term or two term, I don't know really how it's described. He's been there a long period of time. I think it's really important for people to understand and remember. He is the only Palestinian alive today with a convening power, and we need him for that. He is the one who's going to convene that unified leadership framework. He's the only one who can do it. You understand what I'm saying? That is a process. He convenes that, and then a process really begins to unfold and take place. There is different act of leadership, if you will, that begins to emerge in this way. Different act, a different way of managing, begins to emerge as a prelude to further and further political progress and democratization, elections, and what have you. I'm not, on the question of I think the deal, as I said, is something that could be held. It will happen. I would never really give up on the thought of because giving up means what? Giving up means that you are accepting in eternity that you're going to really continue to be in shackles, enslaved by a highly oppressive occupation. No one should be expected to endure that or be accepting of it. Palestinians are no exception.
Okay, down here, Trudy? We have until 10 after, so we hopefully will be able to have a few more questions.
Trudy Rubin, the Philadelphia Inquirer. Do you believe that Hamas or other factions in Gaza would agree to a truce? I know it's been spoken about, but do you think they'd agree? And if you were telling an Israeli leader or leadership why they should enter into talks with a PLO, one of whose largest factions only agreed to a truce, effectively saying after X years the war would be on again, what would you say to the Israeli leadership was why they should go that route?
Thank you, Trudy.
If you could, so we can get more questions in.
Okay. Thank you, Trudy. On the first part of the question, let me say, I think it's plausible that they would find this acceptable. To say the very least, I don't think one would be left out of the room for suggesting something like this to Hamas or Jihad, and there is precedent to this, as a matter of fact, in Hamas's handling of Gaza for periods of time when there was no armed activity or anything like that. So it can happen. Should someone ask for it? I mean, that's what I say. At least let us just begin the conversation. Just really say, okay, you cannot accept the gold standard of open-ended to non-violence. How about a truce? It's well within your platform. It's well within what other national liberation movements around the world accepted. Truce, it's something that is fully admissible. It's not inconsistent with their ideology at all, at all. It doesn't require they change anything, to be honest with you. If they like to change, fine, but if they don't, this is permissible. And certainly it's something that I believe is worthwhile beginning the conversation with. Now, whether or not the extent to which it might be acceptable to Israel, again, pragmatically speaking, I mean, obviously, Israel would like everyone to adhere to the gold standard that's Oslo, for sure. But, if Israel had to choose between, let me use Hamas as an example, if they had to choose between Hamas that A, recognizes the right of the State of Israel to exist in peace and security, which is the language of the Declaration of Mutual Recognition, or if they have to choose between that or Hamas that accepts time-bound commitment to nonviolence. I mean, they can have both, or better, an open-ended commitment to nonviolence. If they can't get both, they'll take both for sure. But if they have to choose, why would they really say no to an offer of non-belligerence for a number of years? I mean, with their rejection of Hamas and their platform and what they stand for, and let me remind everyone, that was precisely what the PLO platform was before. There is an issue of wrenching narrative issues here. So Hamas is not really coming from outer space somewhere. I mean, that's where the PLO was not long ago. Remember? There are many things that one can say about this. So I say, again, let's try it. Let them say no. But why would they say no, even if they disagree with everything else? There is an offer of, clear offer, commitment to nonviolence for a number of years. Why should they say no to it, even if they disagree with everything else? My guess, if the world is confronted with this new Palestinian reality, the world would deal with it in a pragmatic way, not ideological way. It's better than nothing. It's not perfect, but it's good, and I humbly believe it's good enough. It should be good enough to get us going and really begin that process of rebuilding and effecting the transformation necessary, where this is not really about this number of years and then everybody goes back to doing their thing again. But the hope is enough good transformation will have taken place to really take us to the realm of a possible solution, a possible end of this conflict.
Let's take a couple questions right here.
Oh, by the way, just if I may, just one last word I would say about this. Not to be argumentative about this, but this, I keep using gold standard. I'm an economist. Gold standard is gone a long time ago. This really highly exacting standard of expecting all Palestinian factions and components of their government to accept Oslo is not really the conceptual equivalent of it on the Israeli side, has not been expected of Israel, of various Israeli governments. I mean, one would be hard-pressed to really find one cabinet officer in today's Israeli government who really actually subscribes to a meaningful two-state solution. Some may say it, but I really do not know if they really can come close to anything that's acceptable. So if you really want to really begin to deal with this, I'm a firm believer in parity. I'm a firm believer in the non-superiority, non-seniority of any claim or any narrative over any other. So if you want to really expect this of the various components of Palestinian polity, how about really trying your hand with the Israeli side? Maybe that would really begin to bring some rationality into the conversation.
Okay.
Yeah.
With regard to look at the mirror with regard to United States, considering that U.S. Congress, media, and a lot of U.S. institutions have been in control of, practically in control of Israeli and Israeli lobby. So what's any reason to continue with them regarding negotiations or asking to make any help to the Palestinian issue?
To me, that's a good reason to really stay engaged with them, because they really do have that kind of connectivity, I'd say, and potential for making a difference. Now, that has not really translated into the deliverable that we all are looking for so far, but it's hard for me to imagine a process, meaning political process, going forward without really serious engagement and involvement on the part, if not really leadership, on the part of the United States. I mean, the political realities in countries are political realities. At the same time, what we're really talking about here is definitely not an anti-Israel agenda. We're not talking about an anti-Israel agenda here. Two-state solution is not an anti-Israel policy. Two-state solution is meant to be a sensible solution that will work for the benefit of both sides, Israel and Palestinians.
Yeah, let me just add a brief comment.
Yeah.
The U.S. has never been an honest broker. That's a fundamentally flawed and imperfect term. At times, we have been an effective broker. And at those times, our effectiveness has been directly related, not to the genius of American policy making, but to some opportunity, some action in the region that gave rise to a commitment on the part of the parties. It was only then, and that was true of the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty, it was true of Oslo, it was true of the Israeli-Jordanian treaty, it was even true of Madrid. Madrid was brought to fruition in large part because Saddam, acting in an idiosyncratic manner, decided to invade Kuwait, and Bush 41 decided that it would not stand. That opportunity emerged from a set of regional factors. So, you know, I understand full well the imperfections of American policy on this issue, but it's effective. It can be an effective broker at times when the parties themselves are invested. And that's been the major challenge for the last almost 2 decades. Another question. Yes, down here.
Hi, thank you very much for your remarks and your efforts for peace. My name is Dimitri. I'm wondering if you could talk about the Palestine case in terms of the greater transformations in the Middle East now with Syria, Iraq, particularly the Kurds, and how that will affect the Palestinian case. And to follow up on that,
Palestinian children?
what? No, the case for Palestinian statehood, how that is affected by what's going on in the Middle East now, particularly with the Kurds having a similar issue, and how will the influence of Russia now in the region maybe help it become more of a multilateral approach? Thank you.
Yeah. Especially as Palestinian, I would not really, I'm a firm believer in our absolute right to self-determination. I certainly would not deny that right to any other people, for sure, obviously. It's been always to me, as is the case with us Palestinians, how you go about really getting there. And so far as we Palestinians are concerned, there is no question that we had suffered a great deal of marginalization because of development, regional developments, and also internationally as well, with all that's been going on over the past few years. Unprecedented violence and all. But you know, if you really want to think about this, and you said Palestinian case yourself, yeah, I really would like to have that conversation. I say, even there, against all odds, I actually see opportunity. I see opportunity, given my worldview. Here we are, if we are really anchoring the effort to move forward on the notion of emergence of a fully independent state of Palestine, and looking at the extent to which this has become less important an issue, regionally and internationally, relative to everything else that's going on, that would really force us to ask a very important question. I think we force us Palestinians to ask ourselves an important question. What kind of state should we be looking for? I mean, we say a state. You know, even in my own remarks, I have not really said anything about what kind of state. I said something about institutions, effectiveness, capacity, but I did not say anything about attributes of the state. I think even without this marginalization that I talked about, I think it really is incumbent upon us Palestinians to aim for a state that would represent a qualitative addition to a region that has been long known for a time tradition of strong men and weak states. I'm talking about a state that is democratic, progressive, inclusive, where there is no form of discrimination on any basis whatsoever is acceptable, tolerance, and all of that sort of thing. And to me, this is a key ingredient in the fight against the extremism that really has been really behind all of the kind of the unraveling, if you will, the violence, and this kind of really way of thinking, the rejectionism that has been engulfing the region for so many years. So I think in that sense, therefore, if we really begin that discourse saying we really need to work on projecting the reality of Palestinian statehood on the ground, and that state of Palestine is going to be of these attributes, then all of a sudden it really begins to be and look like something that's worthwhile investing in. This is our way of really becoming relevant again. Yes, we can complain about irrelevance, and we can express fears about the possibility of outside-in approaches to peacemaking with Israel and all, and we can say no to these things and express trepidation and concern. The other way is to ask ourselves, what can we possibly do to make ourselves relevant again? And this is one way of making ourselves relevant again. This is a dynamic approach to it. Yes, it accepts the reality of the region being what it is, but it says to the world that this state of Palestine is going to really be a qualitative addition to the region in this sense. But isn't this what really people are talking about when they say, you know, beyond defeating ISIS militarily, what you really need to do is to defeat the ideology? What better can you do than to enable, you know, this state that I'm really talking to you about to emerge, one that really would be of these kinds of attributes that I have just really outlined to you? Isn't that by itself inspiring? That really is the way you know, this is an expression of empowerment that I'm really talking about. This is kind of one aspect of it.
Right, it is Islam, but you got to be careful you don't price yourself out of the market here.
Okay.
The state that you just described, I can't, I mean, I'm an American looking in the mirror right now. I mean, you can't apply, I mean, even, I mean, I'm not an Israeli, but I looked in the mirror. I'm not sure that the definition you apply would even apply to Israel, wouldn't apply to the United States, wouldn't apply to France. States, by definition, are imperfect, and yours will be as well. But you're right to emphasize those principles.
Yeah. Yes, yeah, I agree. I mean, where does absolute justice exist anywhere in the world? You just tell me. But to really begin an exercise by saying we want to really do something that's in the nature of a makeshift whatever,
Right.
and that tells everyone that, you know, that state of Palestine that they Palestinians have been talking about is going to be another failed state and all. That's, you know, one way to go. The other is to say, no, here we beg to differ. We have a different, by the way, I know that this is capable of really getting some attention, for sure, without necessarily pricing ourselves out of market completely. But to tell you the truth, and I think this is why I believe this should be credible. Look, we've been at it for a century. We have gone through great dispossession. We are oppressed. We live the reality of daily oppression under a brutally oppressive occupation regime. It's about time for us to really be free. But freedom is indivisible. You know, the kind of state I'm really describing to you, I'm talking to you, extolling the virtues of which to you today, is first and foremost befitting from the point of view of our own aspirations, the aspirations of the Palestinian people. It is not, you know, they really did not, you know, go through the struggle, generation after generation, with the misery, with the tragedy, with the tears and blood and sweat that really went into this, in order for us to find ourselves living in another failed state. We don't want that. We don't want that for ourselves, and that's why I think this claim to these kinds of attributes that I'm talking about should be viewed as authentic, because first and foremost, it's a Palestinian interest. It responds to a compelling Palestinian need for the state to measure up to the depth of sacrifice and the heights of aspirations that I'm really talking to you about.
Couple more questions, if we have time. Maria Stella, do we have time? One more. Okay. Ziada Asila.
Ziad Asali, welcome to Washington. Things have changed the last 5-6 years since the Arab Spring started, including, you know, the devastation of several states and change in relations between some Arab countries and Israel. What is the impact of the recent changes that may include a diminishment of the priority of Palestine as an issue on the regional calendar? What is the impact of the recent changes on the prospects of realizing the kind of state that you're offering, the process to prepare for a state?
At some level, I think they may induce those interested in moving the process forward, including in the city where we are, actually to try to approach the task of peacemaking through an outside-in approach. And by the way, just because we you know, have a new name for something doesn't mean it was not tried before.
Yeah, that's for sure.
You know, previous rounds of diplomacy did include important Arab dimension to them. And of course, strategically, geopolitically speaking, realities in region and all have introduced this in discourse that, you know, given realignment of interest, shared interest regionally, the prospects of peacemaking are better maybe today than they were before. You know, I don't know how many would say this publicly. I mean, I know that Prime Minister Netanyahu says that a lot, and, but even if it's really discussed and talked about, but I don't see this said or advertised this way by the same Arab countries who are supposed to really do this outside in. And I think there's a fundamental reason for this. And I'm not really disputing the changed landscape in the region. I think deep inside, all know that while it may not be the core issue it once was, it used to be, it really is a key mover, and a key factor, and I think it's really going to be very difficult to kind of somehow parachute over it into realm of so-called normalization, complete normalization, etc. Before, at a minimum, you can work on putting together a scheme that can plausibly deliver. Plausibly is important here. If you can put together some ideas that can promise in a credible way a resolution, then you can begin to really discuss issues related to the Arab Peace Initiative in a more meaningful way. And I think this may be an opportunity. It is not a substitute for what I'm talking about. Actually, if anything, it reinforces it. It's all the more reason for us Palestinians to really begin this by articulating a vision, what it is that we really want to do, how we want to really go about it, beginning with unifying our polity and the rest of it, and the offer of truce, and this is the basis on which we want to re-engage, timeline for ending the occupation, involvement by the United Nations in this way, fully credible, plausible. In a context like this, I can see possibilities for sure. But just beginning with the outside in without nothing, no preparation, no plausible way out, I think it's going to be a waste of time. And I think many will find themselves totally surprised, notwithstanding what they anticipated, that, after all, this is not really working. And tragically, I would say, there are consequences to failure. And I hope enough time would go into, again, asking questions, what do we really need to do to begin going on things that really matter to the ultimate goal of emergence of an independent state of Palestine, and build on it that way.
If Mr. Kushner and Greenblatt haven't been talking to you there, they should be. Please join me in thanking Salam for a fascinating presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks.